Thank you for tuning into Literary Blend, a publishing podcast. I'm your host, Demi Michelle Schwartz. There's no perfect recipe for chasing a dream in the publishing industry, but I hope the conversations on this show give you the ingredients you need to bake yours into reality. So let's flip the page and get into this chapter of Literary Blend. Hello, friends. Welcome back to Literary Blend. Today's chapter is called Diversity in Publishing. And joining me on the show to cover this topic is a fabulous guest I'm so excited to chat with. Please welcome Ciara Smith. Hey, Ciara.
Hi, nice to see you.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you on the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really good, staying busy and taking care of my 2-year-old gremlin.
Perfect. Well, I'm so excited to have you on the show today to chat all about diversity in publishing. But before we dive into that conversation, I would love for you to share a little about yourself and your journey in publishing so far.
Yeah, excellent. I would love to share. Um, it was kind of like a kind of wibbly journey into publishing because I was in the Navy first. And then after that, I had to figure out what I wanted to do. And I had always loved writing and editing. So I went to get my bachelor's in creative writing, and they had writing assignments, of course. So I started writing my first book, which was absolutely terrible. Nobody wants to read it. It's okay. Um, and then, and then I was like, well, I'm not really like gung ho about writing novels. Like I'm gonna try editing. And so I edited for a small press in the UK called Tiger Lily Publishing Company, and that was really amazing experience. But in my process of joining the writing community and getting into publishing, I was like in the writing community on Twitter, and I had seen so many fellow writers who were talking about how agents weren't connecting to their neurodivergent or disabled characters. And I hated that. I was like, I know I can connect with them. So what if I became an agent? So I applied to places for almost a year. And then Corvisiero Literary Agency took me on, and that has been a really exciting journey. I went from apprentice to, or no, intern to apprentice in 4 months. And I'm really excited to help champion authors into publishing.
That's fabulous. Well, congratulations on your journey. And I also think it's interesting how you always loved writing and books, and you realized that maybe being an author wasn't your strongest suit, but you enjoyed editing. And then you're like, wait, but there's this agenting side of things. Let me try that. I think the really cool thing about the publishing industry is that there are so many different roles that people can step into if you love books. And so I think that's great that maybe your strongest area isn't with the writing, but you're really good with business and relationships, and you can work more in the agency side of things. So I think that's really fantastic.
Yeah, it was really great. And it was funny too because we have a like the film side of Corvisiero Literary Agency. So I actually started looking into screenwriting. And that was so much easier than writing novels. Like it just clicked in my brain. I was like, oh, okay. So I'm definitely more for editing and representing books and talking to editors and now screenwriting.
I love it. Oh my goodness, perfect. So now let's dive into our chat about diversity in publishing. So you already mentioned something there about agents not connecting with characters that aren't exactly like them, and I see a lot of tweets like this on Twitter too, and that's a springboard into just your overall general thoughts being in the agenting side of things now, having been involved with publishing for a while now. What are your general thoughts on diversity in the industry?
So my general thoughts is that there are a lot of us at like the middleman portion, I guess, because agents are technically the middleman. We are definitely all craving diversity and wanting to push those books. And I think, like in general terms, what I've been seeing is that publishing is so slow. Like we say this all the time, it's slow to get the contract and so to sell, and slow to even publish after you have the contract. And I think that slowness in publishing is making also the thoughts of like the powers that be slow to get with the diversity, if that makes sense. Because there's a lot, like I said, there's a lot at like the agent and editor level that I'm seeing that are like craving diversity. And then once it gets up to the higher ups, it's a little bit slower to catch.
That's really great insight, and I'm happy you shared that because, like you said, publishing is slow, and I think this is a industry where we don't see quick changes, but I think it's really great now because authors, I feel like, are being more willing to write those stories and to, instead of conforming to maybe the stories they read when they were younger, writing the story they wish they had when they were younger, and writing those stories and then finding an agent to champion them and working the way up. I think that we are in the right direction, and it's fantastic seeing, especially on Twitter, agents tweeting about being open to diversity and looking on manuscript wish lists and seeing that they're specifically saying that we welcome diversity. I think that the changes are starting to happen. There's a lot more room to grow, but it's nice to see that there's some progression.
Yeah, definitely. And funny enough, the self-publishing and the like smaller presses, I feel are like really helping that because they have the opportunity to put those books out. And a lot of trends that you'll find, like the cozy fantasy trend. The Legends and Lattes had been self-published, and then it got picked up by a traditional publisher later on, and now there's a big trend for cozy fantasy. And I think that's one thing that's really helping the diversity aspect is the self-publishing and the small presses that have been doing this for years. They're finally like those trends are getting picked up by traditional publishing as well.
Right, and there is a readership as well, like, you will reach
Mhm.
those readers, and the other thing too that I wanted to mention here, which is a nice point, bringing up the connection with the characters, which is what you mentioned earlier. I am also a freelance editor, and I have been reading a ton of fantastic books recently, and two that are really coming to mind, the protagonists, both are neurodivergent. I personally am not neurodivergent, but I connected so much to those stories because there were other elements in there. The characters were so real. They had human emotions. Just because the voice maybe was a little different than mine, I was still able to connect with them. And I think
Mhm.
that something that I wanted to point out just from my own personal reading experiences is that as long as the writing is strong and the voice is strong, if there's a little bit of a difference, we can always find ways to connect. And another point I wanted to make here as well is that as someone with a condition I don't talk about often for just bad memories that come up with bullying and stuff in high school, I just don't like to talk about it. But I do have an experience where I have been kind of labeled as you are your condition, and that has always really bothered me because nobody is their condition. It's a part of them, but it doesn't define them. And I think the same can be true with these characters. If someone has a disability or someone's neurodivergent, those are qualities, but it doesn't define them, and there are always other things about that character that we can connect to.
Yeah, 100%. And, jumping off of that is like that usually such a small part of what the overall story is. When I first started reading manuscripts, I realized that all these little, like, I love these identities, of course, but the story wasn't the identity. And so I just always had that in the back of my mind. I was like, well, how did these other agents pass, like that I had been seeing of my friends pass on something that like it's not even the story. Like you can still connect to the story and the characters that are going through the story without understanding like that one part of their identity. Because I mean, even in real life, we don't want to be defined by our
Right,
one part of
absolutely.
our
Yeah.
identity.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's a difference between if someone passes, and just as a reader too, if you're not connecting to the voice because there's craft things going on where just the writing isn't there, that's completely different from having a stunning book that someone is putting down just because the character doesn't reflect them. I think there's a difference between that.
It's funny that you mentioned that because that's actually how our agency used to use it. They would use a connection to character line when it was really a craft thing, like there was too much distance with the character. And I had actually brought up that a lot of authors took it a different way, especially like people of color, LGBT, neurodiversity, and all of that. And so they completely changed their phrasing of their letters because they do welcome diversity. Like they're very huge on diversity, and they didn't want anyone to be put off by that specific phrasing. And so now we're more specific of what craft element made it, to where we didn't not connect, but to where we didn't feel the character as much as we had wanted to.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. And I have seen a lot of agents too just being open to hearing. Like, I see threads all the time of agents saying, how can we make our query forms more accessible? How can we make
Mhm.
our rejection forms clearer to not give misinformation on reasons for passing? And I think it's really great that there are agents who are being open to hearing those things, because I think the smoother it is from both sides, the less opportunities there are for misunderstandings, or, for anyone who is filling out a query form who may face barriers for one reason or another, just finding ways to remove as much difficulty and misunderstanding as possible is really important.
Yeah, and that is definitely something that I myself greatly value. I know when I start signing clients, I'm going like one of the first questions I'm going to ask is how can I accommodate? Like even if they're not like out as disabled or neurodiverse, if there's some other kind of marginalizations, because I do definitely want to have primarily underrepresented authors. I'm going to ask how I can accommodate to make sure that there's more equity. I made a long post a long time ago about wanting more equity and like giving people the tools that they need in their circumstances to help them succeed on an even playing field.
Yeah.
And I love that other agents are doing that too.
No, that's fantastic. And I think you bring up a really great point of like asking. I think sometimes, just from a personal experience as well, sometimes if you have some kind of condition or something, people will assume what you need. And just from personal experience, it's not always accurate, and it can come off stereotypical and harmful too. And so I think
Hmm.
listening to the people who are in those shoes directly saying, this is what's going on, this is how we can accommodate if we need to, and being open to listening, I think is really important.
Yeah. I have that experience of my own because I myself am autistic and ADHD and have my own like physical disabilities. So when I first got into the publishing world and everything, it was there was a little bit of, assumptions made, but then I had to learn too of to like voice what I need. I think sometimes um especially neurodivergent and disabled folks, I think sometimes we get used to putting our needs aside. I know I was not used to asking for anything, no accommodations. So that also was really important to learn to ask what I need and not just try to like shoulder on and act like I was able bodied and neurotypical.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a really great point you brought up too. I think, sometimes, like, we may think it's easier to just go with the flow, but at the same time, it's not good for us or anybody else in a situation. And so voicing opinions is really important. And especially in publishing, the more people who talk, the louder the information will be, and the more people who will potentially listen. And so I am all here for, just if you're experiencing something that is challenging or whatever, I think using our voices is one of the strongest things we can do.
I wholeheartedly agree.
Perfect. So there's another thing I wanted to get your opinion on. So when I was querying, there were a lot of agents who were specifically saying like, oh, like I want to represent, diversity, which is fantastic. And there were some agents at times that were specifically open to, just like, there was a period where it was like, I'm only accepting submissions at this time from underrepresented authors, which is great. But just from personal experience, I'm curious to hear what you think on this, but I found myself at times feeling a little uncomfortable because, like I said, I don't talk about my condition often, and it felt strange for me to disclose that to potentially someone I don't even know, and I don't even really talk about it to people in my real life. And so in query letters, feeling obligated to mention it to prove that I wasn't querying them at a time I shouldn't have been or things like that, I just felt really uncomfortable. And more than that, I have always been someone who I'm very academically driven. I've always been about learning and, improving my skills. And in school, I was always like a very good student and everything. And I never wanted to diminish my abilities through the lens of my condition. And so I always wanted to find an agent who chose me because they fell in love with my story and my writing, not to check a box on their list. And I felt this like fear at times, like if I disclose, will I just be checking a diversity box or do they really want to work with me? And so I personally chose to not disclose in my letter. And then when I was on my offer call with my agent, that's when I told her because we were going to be working together and it was important for her to know. But before that, I personally didn't feel comfortable doing that. And so I'm curious to hear what you think on all that.
Yeah, that is a really great point. Obviously, I can't speak for the other agents, but from my own personal thoughts on the subject, I never want anyone to be uncomfortable and disclosing something that they're not ready to disclose yet. One thing I think I am a little bit particular about is when people write about marginalized experiences and it's not their own experience. So I do definitely like the hashtag own voices. I feel like in some areas it has been misused. But I do like it when people include that because then I hope they feel that they don't need to disclose their whole history, but they can be like, this is my experience. Because it's more of like, I want to protect that experience and have that from the voice of the people who actually went through it. And I know this is something that people of color, especially, like they have to contend with this on a regular basis. Their culture and things taken by white people. And that's something that I don't wanna, like, have within my client base is people taking from others' experiences. So I do like the little notation of, like, own experiences, or I do have experience with this without fully disclosing what exactly that entails. And then the other point of it you said open to underrepresented authors only. I can see how that could be uncomfortable, from the writer's perspective, but from an agent perspective, like I got so many queries when I first opened. I didn't expect it. It was over 100, and it is taking me a while to get through them. And it's not so much that I have boxes that I want to check. Like there are certain genres that I really want to represent, but at the same time, there are like I'm really interested in African mythology. Like a person of color who really loves their culture and their mythology, like I would love a fantasy book based on that, or Asian mythology. And it takes a really long time to get through queries to find those specific ones. So I would love eventually to do an underrepresented query time frame just so that those stories don't get buried among everything else. And that's really like giving them the time that I think they deserve and giving them the attention. So it's not just one underrepresented author and a sea of 100. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, that's really interesting, and I'm happy that you're an Asian and we're having this conversation because it's really interesting seeing from like all those perspectives on all of this. But I also really like the point you brought up about authors writing about experiences that aren't their own. I completely agree with the whole idea of if you are writing about an experience and it's your own, that's authentic. And authenticity to me is very important, just in everything. And so I think it's really great to know just vaguely that it's based on a personal experience. That's important to make sure that it's an authentic representation. And It's really great too because, like I said, a couple of the manuscripts that I've been editing, it read so authentic that, like, I definitely didn't ask the author, like, "Is this your experience?" Because that's none of my business as the editor to just ask them that, but the way it was so, like, realistically depicted, it felt like it was from a real experience, and so it came off that way, but I really think it's important how you brought that up too, and another thing that, leading off of this with diversity in manuscripts, so I think it's really great how publishing in general is leaning toward diverse casts of characters and all of that. But that definitely gets into a territory of if you're having a diverse cast, not every character is going to be someone like you if you want to get into that diversity. So, what is your perspective on building a diverse cast while doing it respectfully and not with stereotypes?
Well, my main thing is the main character. I feel like if you don't have some very like specific experience with the main character itself, that I think that one should be a little bit closer to your own experience. But with writing a diverse cast, like I have several friends who like one of the best friends was a person of color and they were like LGBT and they did it really, really well. And I think the best part it would be having beta readers and sensitivity readers. I know in the publishing world, like our agency has sensitivity readers and publishers that we've reached out to as well that have sensitivity readers just to make sure that those extra characters are being represented well and not in a stereotypical fashion. I'm all for having diverse casts, but I think the main character is the one that can lead to frustration the easiest. That sometimes it's easier, especially when you're in the head of somebody. I think that's where it really comes into play is when you're in the head of the main character and it's not an experience of yours, then you don't necessarily know. Like, even if you do get the sensitivity readers or you do have observations, you don't necessarily know what those thought processes are during like difficult times or about certain situations from like representation that you don't share, if that makes sense. Versus like all of the side characters, you're not so much in their head, and you can still, like you do in daily life, have that observation, and hopefully people do pay attention to what's happening around them, pay attention to what's happening to diverse different peoples, so that they can adequately make those observations of their side characters without making the assumptions about what their thoughts are.
Yeah. No, that's really great. And this ties into the last kind of point I wanted to bring up to wrap up on is that I think empathy is really important. Understanding other people in our world is important. I'm always trying to learn and understand others and reading books by authors who aren't necessarily like me to read their stories and discover their characters. I think so much can be learned from reading, not only to learn about others' experiences, but also just to support the diversity in publishing. I think as readers, we can do a lot to support those authors and to let publishing know that these books do matter and they are special, and just to continue to support those authors who are creating those stories.
I 100% agree. I try to make sure with all of my reading that it's not whitewashed because when I was a teenager, that's very much like the books that I had access to, where they looked like me and had kind of my culture, even though they didn't have my neurodiversity and disability. And so now that I'm older and more aware of social issues than I was back then, like I've definitely made sure to support like people of color and people from different backgrounds than myself. One of my favorite things to do, and that I think everybody should do, is if they can't get to their local library, at least get the digital library app and request these books because sometimes they won't have like marginalized authors. But if you do a deep search into their history, then you can specifically request them to read. And I've been doing that a lot. I've found lots of people of color and LGBT, even though I'm in LGBT, but more of the like the trans or the gay stories that I don't have my own experience with. And I've been really lucky to get some of those through my local library. And one of my favorites was Kakai. I hope I'm saying that right. About Indian mythology. And that was really interesting to read their culture and their mythology and their gods that they believed in. And it was just an all around very interesting and amazing story. And I'm really happy I requested that through my library.
Yeah, so much great insight there too. I think that requesting and just showing support any way you can is really important. Like if you read a book, you enjoy it, tell your friends, post about it on social media, share the word, and get other readers flocking to it. So Ciara, it was lovely having you on the show. I would love for you to share any final thoughts you have on diversity in publishing.
Just that I think we need to continue to be loud. I know sometimes when we're put in a little box in our personal lives or we're having to mask or suck it up, whatever it is that we're dealing with, it can be too easy to be quiet. And I think in publishing, especially, it's really important to just keep making our voices loud and known. And the more we talk about our experiences and what we need, I think the more publishing industry will listen.
Perfect. Fantastic. It was a joy having you on the show for this conversation. And this brings us to the plot twist, where I get to ask you a fun question you could have never seen coming. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
If you could be best friends with any protagonist, who would it be?
Oh gosh. Okay. See, this isn't fair because I beta read a lot, and the protagonist that first comes to mind isn't even published yet. But my best friend Shauna wrote a book, and she let me beta read it, and it's about this witchy trio that all hell breaks loose in their town, and then there's this government agency that comes and investigates, so they kind of have to dodge the suits and figure out what's going on. And the main character in that is Amara, and she is the sassiest, troublemaking kind of teenager, and she would be my best friend.
Perfect. Love that. I hope that book is published soon.
Me too. All my fingers are crossed for her.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Can you please share with everybody where they can connect with you online and check out your agenting information if they're interested in querying you for representation?
So for the agenting information, that would be the Corvisiero Literary Agency website. I'm on their representation page. Then the easiest way to find me, just to connect with me and shoot me a message. I'm very much open. Like my DMs are open to any kind of questions anyone wants. That would be Twitter. I know it's kind of different now, but I have a hard time learning new social media sites. So Twitter is just where I have stayed and hunkered down, and I post all the time there.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much again for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, you are so welcome. And listeners, that is a wrap on this conversation with Ciara, all about diversity in publishing. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. If you did, please consider leaving Literary Blend a review and giving it 5 stars to help others just like you discover it. Also, if you have friends in the publishing industry you think would enjoy the show too, please pass it along to them. Thank you for listening, and until next time, happy reading and writing.